Well, good morning. We are at the end of our sermon series. We've been talking about how Christ wants to come to help us to think different. And one of the verses that we've tried to use as a theme verse is this one, Ephesians chapter 4, verse 23. Let the Spirit renew your thoughts and your attitudes. And I really do think that God intends to do that. I think that's normal for the Christian. I had a friend who was a chiropractor, and sometimes people would come in and their back wouldn't be right, and they would say to the chiropractor, is this normal? And his answer was always, no, it's common, but it's not normal. When you talk about what's expected, that's not exactly what you'd expect. It does happen a lot, but it shouldn't. And I thought about that idea, common and normal. It is common for Christians to be proud. It's common for Christians to struggle with anger. It's far too common for Christians to be impatient and judgmental, but that's not normal. What the Bible positions as a normal thing is when the Spirit really has control of somebody, they should think different, and they should have a different attitude, and that you can kind of determine a little bit how much the Spirit's doing. There's no gas tank, of course, on any one of us where we can see empty or full of God's Spirit, but you can tell if a person is really close to God, because some of the things we've talked about the last few weeks, peace and joy and gratitude, you should start to see some of those things pop out of the person. Because, hopefully, as they're thinking more about Christ, as they're filling their heart more with Christ, well then they'll become more like Christ. And I've been having my head on that topic for the last the month. What would that look like in my life? What would that look like for me? To be a little more focused, a little more serious. What parts of my life, what pockets of my life are obviously out of touch with God's Spirit? Because there are some. I mean, what certain conversations and certain ways I carry myself, is it obvious that God doesn't have control of yet? So I've been thinking about that for the last month. And partly because I have been thinking about that, I was drawn to this interview. I was on the internet looking for something else, and sometimes one thing leads to another. And then I found this interview with Dallas Willard. He passed away a couple years ago. He's a Christian author in California, and I've got a couple of his books. Brilliant, really smart guy. And you would do well to read any of Dallas Willard's stuff. But anyway, he was in an interview, and they were asking him, if you could describe Jesus to someone who didn't know Jesus, could describe Jesus in one word, what word would you use? And before I tell you what he said, it's worth thinking about for a second. If you could describe Jesus in a word, what word would you use? Maybe you'd say, well, he's love, or maybe he's Lord, right? Or he's kind. He's always there for me. I mean, you'd pick words like maybe some of those kind of things. He's thoughtful, maybe you'd say, or he's my Redeemer, my Savior. You'd have those kind. Well, anyway, they asked Willard, what would you say? And again, partly it's because you're speaking and, the pressure of the moment, and partly because he's a creative guy, I'm sure. But the word he said is, I think Jesus was relaxed. And I would not have said relaxed. That would not have been one of my first 100 words I would have tossed out. Relaxed would not have popped in there. But it's been in my head ever since he said it. I've been thinking about it. And I think there's something to that. There's a scene where Jesus and his disciples are on the lake, on the Sea of Galilee, and there's a storm, and the disciples are really scared, and Jesus is asleep in the back. It just doesn't bother him at all. There's a scene where he's going through town. He's supposed to get to see somebody. They're on their deathbed. Jesus, you got to hurry, and the crowd is pressing against him. And he takes time. He stops and he talks to this woman and has a conversation with her. He's just relaxed. His first sermon. He's preaching in Nazareth there, and he says something in it, and it makes the crowd so angry they drag him out of the church. They're going to throw him off a cliff and kill him, and it says he just walks through the crowd and goes home, like there's no miracle or anything. He just on his own. He just does his own thing. He's relaxed. Sometimes I'll go home if Julia teaches a lot downstairs and she won't be up here in the service, and I'll go home and she'll say, well, how did it go today? I very rarely will say the crowd grabbed me and took me to a cliff outside of town. Very rarely. And if I did toss that out, I would not have walked home calmly after that. I would have been hiding and running and peeking behind doors. And Jesus just never gets rattled. He just never, ever, ever gets rattled. Now think about how big a deal that is, especially if you're a person who gets rattled all the time, right? I mean, think about how big a deal that is. If you could have lunch with Jesus, how do you picture that going in your head? Do you think that he'd be looking at his watch or his phone all the time? Do you think he'd be, I only have a few minutes. Get right to whatever you want to talk about because I got to go. Don't you assume that he would have all the time in the world? Which is crazy if you think about it, because if anybody was ever too busy, it would have been Jesus, but he's not. He's just relaxed. He trusts that he has just enough time to get done the things that God wants him to do. And it wasn't like he moved at supersonic speed. He moved at the speed of foot, right? I mean, it's a lot slower than we do today. And yet he always had time. And so if I want the Spirit to renew my thought and attitude, I would imagine that at least part of it is I've got to learn to relax just a little bit. I've got to learn how not to keep my own agenda and try to squeeze Jesus into it. I've got to make sure it's his agenda. And I just trust that he's given me enough time and enough energy and enough days to live that I'll get done what he wants me to get done. Now, that's not how our culture operates. Our culture operates very fast, very intense, very speedy. I learned something the other day that I didn't know about Thomas Edison. Edison, of course, we didn't totally invent it, but he's the one who figured out the last parts of the light bulb, and he invented that and was able to make it to where it could be mass produced. That was in 1879. John Mark Comer, in one of his books, says that before 1879, the average American slept 11 hours a day before the light bulb. Think how much different your mental outlook would be if you slept 11 hours a day. Think how much different your family conversations would be. You and the wife, or you and the kids, or you and the boss, or you. Just think how much different it'd be if you were going with 11 hours. It's such a foreign thing. If somebody were in a crowd of people to say, man, I only got 8 hours last night, there'd be somebody in that crowd that said, 8 hours? I'd kill for 8 hours. I only got 7. And somebody else, what, 7? My goodness, what were you doing on vacation? I only get about 5. And it's a competitive thing. To think that people got 11 hours of sleep. What do you think is the cumulative effect on our country of going from 11 hours of sleep to whatever you're getting most nights? What do you think that does to people? Do you think it makes them more relaxed or less? And it's not just that. It's how we operate with media. Most of us are tied to our phones. We're tied to our iPads. We're tied to our computers. We're tied to the television. I mean, we block out big chunks of the day to watch sports or to watch different shows. And there's nothing in and of itself wrong, but there's things that all of those companies do on the other side to keep your eyeballs on them. And most of those things are not going to lead to you being relaxed. I have one friend who I may have mentioned this even. It's really been interesting to me. So if I have, I'm sorry. But I have a friend who was told a couple of weeks ago that she went to the doctor because I can't get to sleep. I just toss and turn all night long. And I never used to be this way. And now, over the last year, it's gotten worse and I can't sleep. So the doctor did blood tests, and they did a bunch of different sleep tests and different things, and nothing was showing up. And so after they'd done 2 or 3 of these tests, the doctor said, let me ask you a question. Before you go to sleep, do you watch Fox News or MSNBC? And she said, yeah. There you go. Quit doing that, he said. And she did, and she sleeps fine. Just made that one little change. And I know as I'm saying this that there'll be some people thinking, wait a minute. I watch Fox News or I watch MSNBC. What do you mean? Well, see, the thing is with those kinds of shows, they know that the way to keep you watching more is if you're a little bit angry or anxious or fearful. And you'd go to them to either get reinforcement for that anger or to get some relief from that fear. So they on purpose kind of keep you a little on edge. It's to their growth as a business model to keep you a little bit on edge. And we just consume that stuff, and then we wonder why we're not relaxed, why we're not in the right headspace, why we're not where we ought to be. But Jesus was relaxed, and he didn't get rattled. He didn't get anxious or worried or afraid. He had time to slow down. One thing I notice about myself is that when I'm really rushed, really in a hurry, I don't care why people are slowing me down. I just want them out of the way. If I'm driving into town and I'm really late and there's a guy in front of me going 5 miles under the limit, I don't care what he's going through. I don't care what might have put him here at this moment. I don't care, if he seems like he's having a hard time, I don't care. Just get off the road and have your hard time, right? If I'm at the store and I'm late and I'm trying to get through and the person in front of me is having a hard time getting their money together or having a hard time remembering what they wanted to say or get their list, I don't care why they're having a hard time. I just want them to get out of the way, right? I don't care what they're doing. I just want them out of my way. The busier I am, the more my vision and my worldview narrows down to where really I only have enough view for me. And Jesus never does that. He's going into Jericho, and there's a man in a tree. What you doing in the tree? And they have a conversation. We should get lunch, he says. And they go out, and a life has changed. And Jesus was in a fantastic hurry, but he had time for that. He goes into another town, and he's really tired. And he says, hey, fellas, you go get food. I'm going to sit here by this well and hang out. And there's a lady there, and she doesn't want to talk to anybody. And so he starts talking to her anyway. And she kind of tries to start a fight 2 or 3 different times, but he won't bite. He just shows grace. And after showing all that grace, her life has changed. Jesus had a way of seeing people, and no matter how fast he was running, that never changed. Now, I want to mention, before I get much deeper into this thing, that this sermon will not relate to everyone. And that's okay. That's okay. I try real hard for it to relate to everybody, but it won't, and that's okay. There will be some people, as they're thinking about their lives, they just don't struggle with any of the stuff I'm talking about. And that's really cool if that's you. That's a good thing. But I would imagine that there's some people who, when they think about their life and they think about their main relationships, husband, wife, and with the kids and neighbors and coworkers and the job and different things, the church, and you think about those things, you're going to find some gaps between who you wish you were and who you are. There's going to be some gaps between, well, I wish, and not just in the well, nobody's perfect sense. I don't mean that at all, because everybody could say that. But but there's some things, right? And it's mostly for you that I'm preaching today, because God can change your thoughts and attitudes, and the only one stopping that from happening is you. Now, I just really want to focus on just one verse. There's a couple verses of prologue to it, but one verse really want to focus on. Here's the prologue. Jesus says, if you love only those who love you, well, what good is that? Even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to those who do good to you, well, what good is that? Even sinners do that. And if you only lend to those who you don't get repayment from, well, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners, expecting to be paid back in full. And his point with all these things is not that you shouldn't take care of people close to you. You should be good to your family. You should be good to your friends. It's good to be good. It's nice to be nice. His point is, you can't really pat yourself on the back for that. If you've got a close friend and it's a dear friend of yours and now they're going through a hard time, and 3 times this week you took meal over to them, well, that's awesome. Boy, way to go. But you did it because they're your friend. And you did it because you know they would do it for you. And that's a good thing. Nothing bad about that. You should do that. That's the very kind of thing you should do. But it's not heroic. Hitler would take a casserole to somebody if they were his friend, right? It's not. Do you picture Hitler with casseroles? I'm getting off into a weird conversation. But the idea is you do good things, right? If they're good to you, you would do good to them. You do. That's what people do. Now, you never do as much good. The level of goodness has a way of going down, the more we pass it back and forth. But that's okay. You would always be good. And Jesus said, that's fine, but it's nothing heroic. He says, if you really want to be where I want you to be, this is the verse I want to focus on, this next one. And this is the Luke 6:35. Just such a fantastic verse. He says, but love your enemies and do good to them and lend to them without expecting to get anything back. And then your reward will be great. And you'll be like children of the Most High, because he's kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. I just think that's a powerful thing. He says, love the people who are hard. Love the irritable people, the grouchy people, the frustrating people. Love on them too. It's easy to love on the ones who love you back, but love on the ones who can't do anything for your social standing. Be kind to the person who's sitting by themselves, all by themselves, even if it makes It makes your life a little harder. And when you do that, he says, well, then you're like a son of the Most High. You're like a daughter of the King. When you do that sort of thing, people will see it. And they may not totally appreciate it, but your reward in heaven's going to be great. Because God says, that's the very kind of person I want you to be. He says, because that's how I am. God says, I'm kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. And I guess when we think about who this sermon's for, it's for those people who, when I say love your enemies, or be kind to the ungrateful, or be kind to the wicked, you thought of somebody. Somebody's face came into your head. That's especially who I'm talking to, right? It is you. Sometimes people will go home from church and say, I felt like he was talking right to me. If somebody's face came into your head, I'm talking right to you. You are the one that I have in mind. It's those people who, for whatever reason, they just rub us wrong. Or maybe they've done something mean to us. Or maybe they betrayed our trust. Or maybe there's somebody that we have to deal with, but there's so much stuff piled up, so much awfulness. A marriage that has been dead for a long time, and just one's mean to the other, and just keeps piling up. And it's like them? I've got to be kind to them? And again, you don't have to. It's not a have-to verse. But if you want to be like a son of the Most High, if you want to be like a daughter of God, then this is what you have to do. This is what God does. He's kind even to the people who aren't kind back. He's kind even to the people who won't ever say thank you, who won't ever appreciate it. Can you love the person who's going the other direction? Can you love the one who won't help you get ahead? The kid who's sitting all by themselves in the high school cafeteria, the person who has alienated everybody else in the office with a bad attitude, the one who won't make your life. You go into a room, a party at the family get together, and you immediately say, "Well, I don't want to get at a table with them." That person. Can you be kind to them when they're not going to give you anything back? Jesus was. I told you about the story with Zacchaeus when he goes into town and he sees Zacchaeus there. He says, "Come, let's go eat together." And we don't know what they talk about at their meal, but we know what everybody else was talking about. When they see Jesus and Zacchaeus go eat together, they're offended. Why is he hanging out with somebody like that? I mean, Jesus is trying to be somebody. This is like the worst kind of person. Jesus wasn't at all worried about his reputation. He wrecked his reputation. I mean, there were people who liked Jesus before, but then they see Jesus eating with a guy like that, and they don't like him anymore. It hurt his polling, right? He was polling real good with millennials, and then all of a sudden, he's not polling well anymore, and they don't like him. And a lot of people, when they see their polling numbers start to fall, will get out of that situation, right? But Jesus doesn't. And I'm real grateful he didn't with me, because I've certainly given him lots of reasons to. And Jesus hanging with me even when there's nothing to benefit him in that, and everything to benefit me. And if I want to be like him, then I've got to do that too. I'm fond of taking the shortcut, but Jesus didn't do that. He went the long way. He just was relaxed. Can you love somebody who disagrees with you politically or theologically? I'm on Twitter sometimes, and I'll see people get into fights about all sorts of things. A 40-thread deal back and forth about how they're mad and just call each other awful names back and forth. I've seen close friends who aren't close friends anymore because they disagreed about Dr. Fauci. And I'm not saying that Dr. Fauci is or is not a good or bad person, but he's certainly not an important enough person for me to lose a friend. That's incredible to me that happened, and happened a lot. Jesus didn't do that. When he was talking to that Samaritan woman at the well, she takes little shots at him. She says, "Well, here you are, a Jewish man, and I'm a Samaritan woman. What are you doing talking to me?" In other words, you Jews are prejudiced all the time about us. You don't like us. What are you doing talking to me? And then when he talks to her a little longer, he says, "Well, we think Jacob is our father, not yours. We think he's the father of the Samaritans, not the father of the Jews. What do you think about that?" And she's tossing stuff at him, trying to get him ticked off, and he just won't take the bait. He just won't argue with her. He won't do it. He won't. I've talked about this before too. You're going to get to heaven one day, and there's going to be lots of things that God could have disagreed with you about. You think that's how your first day of heaven's going to be? Before I let you in, Chuck, let's talk about where we disagree. I don't think it'll be like that. I mean, in any of your pictures of heaven, is it like that? Do you think he's going to make you jump through 20 hoops before, okay, I just need to hear you say you're sorry one more time, we'll get past it. He loves you anyway. He loves you even though you're ungrateful. He loves you even though you're wicked. He doesn't take the bait. Not like I do, and not like so many people do. I read something, I had a different thought in my head, and it led me to, again, that same chain, that was the Dallas Willard chain. It led me to a thing about pearls. I don't know how I got there, but I did. And most pearls are done commercially now. You have oysters in a set deal, and you give them a thing to make a pearl with, and you watch it and you deal with it. But it's not hard to make a pearl. We know how to do it. All you need is an oyster and a lot of time and an irritant, just something to irritate the oyster, and he gets it in his mouth there, and he'll start covering it with this nacre, and then before too long, after a while, it's a pearl. Just one coat after another. All you need is an irritant and a lot of time. And that's what Jesus is talking about when he says, love your enemies. If you want to become like Jesus, all you need is an irritant in your life and some time. Now, again, I want to talk to the people who had a face in their head when I said the irritant. But even if you don't have an irritant, call the church. We keep a list of irritants. We can set you up with someone just to work with in your spare time. God will provide an irritant. That's how life works. Sooner or later, it'll be provided unto you. And when it is, you can decide what you're going to do with it. A lot of people just chase it out and avoid it and get away, and nothing ever powerful happens there. But Jesus was relaxed. And if I want to be like Jesus, then I don't get too rattled about people. I love them anyway. Can you even love your enemies? King David, if you remember the story about King David in the Bible, he eventually, before he's king, he's told he'll be king. Samuel sits him down and says, you're going to be king of Israel. I've chosen you. The only problem is there's still a king already. There's a guy named Saul who's the king, and Saul's not interested in not being king any longer. And so when he finds out that David's been told he'll be the king, Saul says that David's now public enemy number one, and David for several years has to hide. He has to run away. It's kind of like a Robin Hood story, and he will steal from certain people and give it to the poor, and he's in caves, and the people kind of like him, and they're kind of getting behind him, but he's in danger all the time for years and years and years. And finally, King Saul dies. Now, normally in that time period, in that part of the world, if the old king died, the first thing the new king would do is kill anybody who could be king. So if you have Mr. Smith dies and Mr. Jones is now the king, first thing Jones would do is kill all the Smiths so that nobody could come along and say, well, I'm really the one who should be king. I'm the son or grandson or whatever of the last guy. But David doesn't do that. In fact, there's this story pretty early where he says, is there anybody left in that family that I can show some kindness to? It's a weird verse. It's in a 1 Samuel there. Is there anybody I can show some kindness to? And they say, well, yeah, there's a grandson. He's crippled in both feet. His name's Mephibosheth, and you could show. Well, okay, bring him. He says, I want to show some kindness. It's planned, right? I mean, this was the family that had done all the awful things to David, and yet one of the first things he does when he's king is, I don't want to be like all the other kings. Is there anybody there that I could show some kindness to? And sometimes it'll have to be that way with you. It won't come natural, especially if there's somebody who you and they just don't get along, or you and they really don't have much in common, or you and they don't have a lot of bridges to naturally connect to one another. You'll have to be kind of strategic. You might have to be anonymous and just do some nice thing for them and keep it just between you and God. But you can do it. You can do it if you really want to be like Jesus. And again, that's who this is for, right? This whole idea. It's for the person who is discontent with how unpeaceful they are. It's for the one who's discontent with how they feel no joy, how they're constantly anxious or worried or afraid. It's for the person who feels like their life has no point. Like, what are we even doing? It's for those people. It's for the, we sing a song, "Oh, come all ye faithful." This is for the unfaithful. This is for the ones on the other side of the spectrum who are just barely hanging on. And by the way, that's most of us at different times. Can you be kind and show some strategy to help the one who can't help you at all? This bed ministry that we're doing, and we've talked about it in the services the last 3 or 4 weeks. If you're not aware, we're trying to make beds for kids who don't have beds. We got the idea from a group in Evansville that was doing it, and their slogan was, "Nobody sleeps on the ground in our town." That was the slogan of the deal, which is a pretty cool slogan. We didn't steal that, but that was a pretty cool slogan. But that's kind of our idea too. We don't want anybody to sleep on the ground here. So if you're a family and your kid doesn't have a bed, call us and we'll get them a bed. That's how it started. And we thought we might have 30 or 40 beds to make. Evansville has done 500, but Evansville's 10 times our size, so we thought we might have 25 or 30 beds, and that'd be it. Well, we've got 125 beds at least on the list, and I think more than that. And so we've been making beds, and we've been helping families that couldn't do it, and it's just been one of the best things we've ever done. It really, really is. And I had a whole bunch of stories that you could talk about on this thing, but one story that kind of stood out to me the last week is a family that was in a pretty rough shape, and we went and helped them out, and I'm glad to do it. And they were glad we did it, and it was real, everybody was happy about the whole thing, and our guys drop the bed off and go back to town. They get a message, a text, and the text says, "This little guy doesn't want to leave his bed. He's got his toys there, and it's like an island in the middle of the house. This is his space, And here's a little guy that we gave dignity to. Now, I don't know if the little guy will come to know God. There's no guarantees on any of this stuff. I don't know if the little guy will ever come to Mount Pleasant. I don't know any of those things. But we're not called just to do good to those who do good to us. We're called to do good to even those who are far away from us, maybe even go in the other direction. Because every once in a while, when you toss those hooks into the water, God moves. And you don't get to decide when that happens. God decides when that happens. We just have to be relaxed. Right? Just look for the opportunities. Is there anybody that I could show kindness to for God's sake? Is there anybody that I could show some affection to for Jesus' sake? Help me, God, to make some sort of a pearl out of this awful situation. And I think if you pray those kinds of prayers, He'll move. I think, for whatever it's worth, that our church, well, actually, let me make sure I go slow and sink this in good. I really do think our church, Mount Pleasant, our church on this hill, can improve our whole community in a tangible way if we take this attitude. I think you'll be able to look back and say, well, that's when it all started to change. And it's just showing grace. It's nothing heroic. It's just showing kindness. And every one of us should be part of that. So, finishing up this whole series now, bring it to this last point. If you want to have more of these kinds of things in your life, love and joy and peace and patience and goodness and gentleness and faithfulness and self-control, if you want more of those kinds of things in your life, what do? Well, you've got to let God get in more. It always starts with God. You've got to ask God to move. You've got to ask God to change you. And maybe that's the whole prayer. God, change me. God, move in me. God, open my eyes. And it's not deep, it's childish, but it's real. If you mean it, it's powerful. And so it always starts with God. At the end of our service, we have a time to pray, and we challenge people to come and pray that. If you can't think of anything else to pray, come. And we had somebody do that first service. I found out later on. I want God to change me. That's always a good place to start. And take advantage of this time and this moment and do that. But then second, it's not just that. You've got to create some space for God to move. You've got to relax just a little bit. You've got to let go of some of your agendas and some of your need to be right. And especially for those people who had somebody's face in their mind. When we talk about the enemy or talk about the ungrateful or talk about the wicked, you thought of somebody. Especially in those situations, you've got to learn to let that go. Imagine a husband and wife, and they've been cross and mean and ugly with each other for years. If one person, either of them, husband or wife, said, I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm just not going to respond in kind. I'm just going to show grace. Could that work? It's hard to imagine. But I think it could. I think the way of Christ, with a G.K. Chesterton quote, I think the way of Christ has not been tried and found difficult. I think it's been found difficult and not tried. Won't you give this a shot? And just show some grace this week and see if God doesn't move in your life. And again, this sermon's not for everybody. It's not. Too many people, I sit out there sometimes. I was there last week when Josh was preaching, and it's easy to tune out. And it's easy for the sermon not to really hit what you're going through. You know, it's not for everybody, and I get that. But I am praying for those today who I'm talking to. I'm pulling for you, and I want you to know I am. And I hope and pray you take advantage of this time. It's important. Now, at the end of our service with the guys on both sides, they're going to talk to you, hopefully, about, is there anything I can pray for you or do for you? And for some of you, the big thing you need done, I need to know the Lord. I need to know Him. And if that's where you're at, then when you come up here, they'll pray with you and ask with you and pray with you and ask God to move. I want to challenge you right now that they're going to ask you to consider turning your life and try to follow Him. I'm challenging you that too. It's called repenting scripturally, and you make that decision, you're going to turn around. They're going to have you come here to the front with one of us, and we'll confess in front of everybody what it is that we believe. And then we'll talk about baptism. I know all those things are scary, and you don't have to do them all in fast order. But the whole picture of baptism is beautiful, that you go into the baptistry and you're you. And they wash away the old and you're new again. And anybody can come into that. That's the promise of God. And it's not something we offer, it's something that He offers. So know that all that's available today, if anybody needs it. Anybody calls out for it, I challenge you to do so. Won't you stand up? I'm going to have the band come back up, and I want to pray with you. Let's pray. Dear Lord God, I thank